She thought moving into her late grandfather's house after the divorce would be a fresh start. But when she opened the old garage, she found something that changed everything she thought she knew about him. Subscribe to the channel, share this video with your friends, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The train slowed as it entered the small town, its wheels screeching against the rusted rails, echoing through the empty platform. Anna Miller sat by the window, her reflection faint in the glass, the outline of her tired face framed by the dim winter light. Her hands rested on a single worn suitcase, the only thing she had brought with her after leaving everything behind. The city, the apartment, the marriage, the endless noise of a life that had promised stability but delivered nothing but exhaustion. The final papers of her divorce had been signed 2 weeks ago. There had been no arguments, no tears, just silence, and the cold efficiency of signatures that divided years into 2 clean halves, before and after. Her ex-husband had barely looked at her. His life was already moving on, sleek and uninterrupted, while hers had unraveled in quiet pieces. Now she was returning to the one place she had not seen in more than 20 years, her grandfather's old house on the outskirts of town. The house had stood empty since his death, and the rest of the family had long dismissed it as useless, a relic of stubborn pride. They had called him eccentric, a man who wasted his life tinkering with useless machines in a crumbling garage. But to Anna, he had been the only person who ever looked at her as though she mattered. She remembered the way he used to kneel beside her when she was small, carving tiny wooden airplanes at his workbench, letting her hold the pieces and telling her stories about the sky. Every person needs a wing, he would say, even if they never leave the ground. The train hissed to a stop. Anna stood, her legs unsteady, and stepped onto the platform. The town looked smaller than she remembered. The air smelled of rain and soil, and a thin fog clung to the fields beyond. She took a taxi through streets that seemed suspended between memory and decay-boarded windows, peeling paint, the ghost of a grocery store that had once been alive with voices. When the car turned onto the narrow dirt road that led to her grandfather's house, her chest tightened. The property appeared through the mist like something half-remembered from a dream. A sagging roofline, broken shutters, and a yard overtaken by weeds. The wooden fence leaned inward, as though bowing under the weight of time. The driver hesitated. "You sure this is the place, miss?" "Yes," she said quietly. "This is it." He helped her unload the suitcase, then drove away, leaving her alone in the silence. The sound of his engine faded, replaced by the low hum of wind moving through the grass. She stood for a long moment, staring at the front door. It was painted a dull shade of blue, flaking in long strips, the same color it had been when she was a child. Her hand trembled as she turned the knob. The hinges creaked, releasing a rush of air that smelled of dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic like oil that had seeped into the floorboards. Inside, the rooms felt frozen in time. The furniture was still in place, the wooden chair by the window, the table covered with yellowed newspapers, the bookshelf heavy with old manuals and flight magazines. A photo on the wall caught her attention. Her grandfather, Henry Miller, smiling in a leather jacket, his hair tousled by wind. Behind him, she recognized the outline of the very house she was standing in. The photograph had been taken decades ago, when both he and the house were still strong. She walked slowly through each room, touching the surfaces as if to reassure herself that it was real. The house made small sounds, the faint ticking of an unseen clock, the whisper of air through the cracks in the walls. Every corner seemed to hold an echo of her grandfather's presence. On a shelf above the fireplace stood the small wooden airplane he had once carved for her. Its propeller was broken, but she smiled when she saw it. She remembered the way he had handed it to her and said, "When the world feels too heavy, hold this. It'll remind you to look up." That memory hurt now. The first night, she slept on the old couch in the living room. The house creaked and sighed around her, as though resenting the intrusion after years of solitude. Rain began to fall outside, soft at first, then harder, drumming against the roof. She lay awake, listening to it, feeling the weight of her choices press against her chest. The silence was so complete, it was almost physical. She had run away from a life that had suffocated her. Yet here, surrounded by stillness, she felt both safe and unbearably alone. The following morning, she made coffee on the old gas stove and watched the light seep through the kitchen window. Dust danced in the beam like faint golden threads. She wandered outside, her boots sinking into the damp ground. The backyard stretched far beyond what she remembered. The trees had grown wild, their branches tangled in vines. And at the edge of the property stood something she had nearly forgotten, the large metal structure of her grandfather's garage, half swallowed by ivy. It loomed over the yard like a sleeping beast, its roof sagging in the middle, the doors rusted shut. As a child, she had been forbidden to go near it. "That's Grandpa's place," her mother would say sharply. "There's nothing in there for you." But curiosity had always tugged at her. She remembered pressing her ear against the door and hearing strange noises, clangs of metal, the steady rhythm of tools. Once she had seen light spilling out from under the cracks late at night, the silhouette of her grandfather moving inside. She had asked him once what he was working on, and he had only smiled, his eyes crinkling with a secret he would never tell. Now, standing before the same door, she felt that same pull, a quiet insistence, a whisper from the past. She brushed her hand over the metal handle. The lock was still there, crusted with rust. A faded no entry sign hung crookedly above it. She tried to peer through a small gap, but all she could see was darkness. Later that afternoon, the neighbor stopped by. A thin woman in her 70s, with sharp eyes and a voice that carried the weight of gossip. "You must be Henry's granddaughter," she said, holding out a jar of jam. "I'm Mrs. Brown. I live 2 houses down. Haven't seen anyone here in years." Anna thanked her politely. Mrs. Brown's gaze drifted toward the garage. "You be careful with that old thing. He was obsessed with it, you know. Spent every hour in there after your grandmother passed. No one knew what he was building, but he guarded it like treasure. Some said it was dangerous. Others said it was just another one of his hobbies gone too far. After he died, no one dared to open it." Anna frowned. "Did he ever tell anyone what it was?" The old woman shook her head. "Not a soul. Whatever secret he had, he took it with him." She hesitated, then added softly, "He always said it wasn't ready yet." That night, Anna couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, but the wind outside howled through the cracks of the window frames. The house seemed to breathe. Every creak sounded like footsteps, every sigh like a voice whispering through the walls. Around midnight, she sat up, drawn once again to the thought of the garage. The image of it haunted her, the locked doors, the hidden silence behind them. She dreamt restlessly, her sleep filled with fragments of memory. In her dream, her grandfather stood beside her, smiling, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. The light behind him was golden, almost blinding. "Knees to the sky, Anna," he said, his voice echoing in the dream. "Wings don't rust. They just wait." She woke with a start, her heart pounding, the echo of his words still in her ears. Dawn was just beginning to break, a pale glow spreading through the curtains. She dressed quickly, pulled on her boots, and went outside. The air was cold and smelled of wet earth. The grass glistened with dew. The garage stood in silence, its doors streaked with rust and shadow. Her hands trembled as she picked up a hammer from the porch and approached. The first blow against the old padlock rang out through the still morning air. It took several strikes before the metal cracked and fell away. The hinges protested with a long, painful creak as she pushed the doors open. The smell hit her first, a mix of oil, dust, and time itself. The air was heavy, untouched for years. Light filtered through a single grimy window, cutting a narrow path through the gloom. She stepped inside slowly, her boots stirring layers of dust that rose and shimmered in the beam of light. The interior was vast, cluttered, but strangely orderly. Workbenches lined the walls, each covered in tools and mechanical parts, neatly arranged as if waiting for their owner to return. Shelves held jars filled with bolts and washers, each labeled in her grandfather's meticulous handwriting. In one corner stood a stack of notebooks tied with string, their covers darkened with age. But it was the center of the garage that made her stop. A massive object sat under a thick tarp, its shape broad and smooth, unmistakably metallic. For a moment she couldn't move. She stepped closer, her heart thudding, her breath shallow. The air seemed to hum with tension. Her fingers caught the edge of the tarp. The fabric was stiff and rough, coated in years of dust. She hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment. Then, with a slow pull, she peeled it back. Dust billowed into the air, blinding her for an instant. When it cleared, she saw it, gleaming faintly beneath the grime. The rounded nose of a small airplane, its paint faded, but still bearing the faint blue letters. Cessna 150. For a long moment, she simply stared. The light caught on the curve of the wing, on the edge of the propeller frozen in place. The sight was surreal, impossible. Her grandfather hadn't just been tinkering. He had built this. He had hidden it here all these years. The silence of the garage deepened, thick and reverent. Anna reached out, her hand trembling, and brushed her fingers along the metal surface. It was cold to the touch, but beneath it, she felt something alive, an echo of his heartbeat, perhaps, or her own. She took a step back, eyes wide, breath caught between disbelief and awe. The wind outside shifted, rattling the doors. She looked around at the rows of tools, the notebooks, the careful precision of everything. Her grandfather had built a secret world here, a sanctuary of dreams that no one had ever known. And now it belonged to her. The morning light grew brighter, spilling across the airplane's body, illuminating the faded letters and the gentle curve of its wing. Anna stood motionless, her mind racing, her heart heavy with wonder and grief. For years she had believed she was returning to an ending. But now, standing in the dust and silence of her grandfather's garage, she realized it was only the beginning. The morning light entered the garage through narrow slits in the wooden panels, revealing what had been hidden from the world for decades. Dust still hung in the air from where Anna had pulled back the tarp, but as it settled, the shape before her became clearer. The compact body of the small airplane, its wings folded slightly inward, its aluminum skin dulled by age. She stood there for a long time, unable to move, staring at the blue letters painted on the side. Cessna 150. The name alone felt almost sacred, like a whisper from her grandfather's past, finally reaching her. The discovery from the previous day had left her sleepless. She had sat up most of the night in the living room, a single lamp burning beside her, replaying the moment over and over again in her mind. The idea that her grandfather had built an airplane, an actual airplane in secret, without anyone knowing, bordered on the impossible. And yet here it was, solid and real. The thought of it filled her with both awe and sadness. She could see him now, years ago, hunched over his workbench, hands steady despite age, the dim light of a single bulb illuminating his face as he worked through the night. The The world outside had thought him a fool, but he had built this with patience, precision, and love. Now the machine sat silent before her, a monument to his stubborn hope. Anna stepped closer, tracing her fingers along the body. The dust came off in soft streaks, revealing glimmers of pale blue beneath. She peered inside the cockpit through the fogged glass, her heart tightening at the sight of 2 seats side by side, worn but intact. She unlatched the door, its hinges groaning from disuse, and climbed carefully inside. The smell of old leather and oil surrounded her, thick but not unpleasant. Her grandfather's touch lingered everywhere, the instruments labeled in neat handwriting, the controls polished from countless hours of work. There was even a small brass plate fixed near the panel, engraved with words that made her chest ache. Aurora Project. H. Miller. She sat in the left seat, resting her hands lightly on the yoke. The metal was cold, but she could almost imagine it coming alive again, responding to his steady hands, his quiet confidence. Outside, the wind pressed faintly against the walls of the garage, creating a low hum that seemed to echo through the space. For a moment, she felt as if the airplane itself was breathing. Curiosity took hold of her. She climbed out of the cockpit and began exploring the rest of the garage. Along the shelves, every inch of space was filled with the evidence of a lifetime's obsession. Tools arranged by size, sketches pinned to the walls, notebooks stacked neatly in boxes labeled with years. She opened one of them at random. The pages were filled with diagrams, calculations, notes written in pencil that had faded to gray. The handwriting was her grandfather's precise, firm, and somehow gentle at the same time. She turned the pages slowly, realizing these were not idle doodles or fantasy plans. They were meticulous records of mechanical details, wing measurements, engine configurations, material lists. Her grandfather had been methodical, perhaps even brilliant. At the back of the garage stood an old wooden cabinet. She tugged at the handle, and the door opened with a squeal. Inside were more documents, some tied together with string, others sealed in envelopes. She pulled out one thick bundle and sat down on an overturned crate to read. They were letters, some written by her grandfather, others replies from people she didn't know. The dates ranged from the early 60s to the late 70s. Many bore the logos of small engineering firms, aviation clubs, and even the Cessna Aircraft Company itself. Most of the responses were polite rejections. Dear Mr. Miller, we appreciate your enthusiasm, but cannot pursue this design at this time. Others offered suggestions or technical clarifications, and yet he had kept everyone, each carefully folded, as though each no had only strengthened his resolve. Among the stack was a smaller envelope that looked different. It was sealed, the paper yellowed and brittle, and across the front, in faded ink, was a postmark dated 1976. The corner bore a faint stamp with the logo of a Midwestern aviation fair. She turned it over, hesitant, then slid her finger under the flap and opened it. Inside was a neatly typed letter. It began with, Dear Mr. Henry Miller, we are pleased to inform you that your submission, Aurora 1, has been selected for exhibition at the National Experimental Aircraft Convention. Please confirm your attendance. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. He had been accepted. He had done it. And yet, somehow, he had never gone. The envelope had never been opened. The letter had been waiting here for nearly 50 years. She pressed the paper against her chest, her breath unsteady. The realization struck her with a quiet pain. He had achieved what he dreamed of, but time or circumstance, or perhaps his own failing health, had kept him from knowing it. The world had never seen his creation, never recognized the brilliance hidden behind the old man everyone mocked. And she, his granddaughter, was the first person to finally see it. She spent the rest of the day reading through his notes. Each page revealed more of the man she had only partly known. His calculations were precise, but his marginal notes were deeply human. Small reflections written in the margins like fragments of thought. Wind is like time. It doesn't stop, but it can carry you if you understand it. Dreams are not foolish if they keep you alive. When they laugh, listen harder. The sound means you're closer to something real. She traced the words with her fingertips, her eyes burning. In every line, she could feel him speaking to her across the years. The following morning, Anna returned to the garage with renewed determination. She found an old rag, a bucket of water, and began cleaning. Each sweep of her hand across the airplane's body felt like an act of reverence. The dust gave way to pale blue paint that caught the morning light. She cleaned the windows, revealing the cockpit more clearly, and reorganized the scattered tools. In the process, she discovered a small key taped to the underside of the workbench. It fit perfectly into a locked drawer on the other side of the room. Inside, she found a small notebook bound in cracked leather. The first page was dated 1975. The writing was smaller here, more personal. He had written about the challenges of balancing his dream with the expectations of others. "They think I am wasting time," one entry read. "But what else is a man to do when the sky still calls his name?" Another note from months later said, "The engine runs smoothly now. The balance feels right. I believe she will fly, though perhaps not with me at the controls." The word "she" had been underlined twice. He had written about testing the parts, about painting the wings himself, about saving money by repairing discarded pieces from old models. There were also notes about Anna Small, tender mentions that she hadn't expected. "Anna visited today. She asked if clouds have weight. I told her they do, but they never let it stop them from drifting." She closed the notebook gently and sat for a while in silence. The air smelled faintly of metal and earth. Her heart ached, but not in the way it had when she'd first arrived. It was an ache full of longing, but also of purpose. The more she learned, the more she understood that her grandfather had not been building this machine for himself, alone. He had been building a legacy of belief proof that even when life closes every door, a person can still open the sky. As the days passed, she began to spend nearly all her time in the garage. The house itself remained quiet, a place for sleep and coffee, while the garage became her world. The sound of wind outside blended with the quiet clinks of tools, the rustle of paper, the soft hum of her thoughts. She studied diagrams late into the night, trying to decipher what each line and note meant. She searched the internet for information on restoring vintage Cessna engines, reading about the Continental O200 models that her grandfather had mentioned. Slowly, she began to piece together the puzzle of what he had done and what might still be done. One afternoon, while checking under the seat in the cockpit, she discovered another hidden compartment. Inside was a small, wrapped package. She opened it carefully and found a pocket-sized journal with pages filled in the same familiar handwriting. It seemed to have been written during the last months of his life. The entries were shorter, the writing shakier, but the spirit within them was unbroken. "If someone finds this," one of the final pages read, "then I will know I was right to keep believing. This plane isn't just a machine, it's the last thing I have left of myself. And if someone finishes what I began, I will be content." By the time she reached the last entry, tears were streaming down her face. She closed the journal and looked up at the plane. It felt as if he were there with her, quiet and steady, waiting for her to take the next step. She walked to the front of the aircraft, brushed the dust from the propeller, and placed her hand on it. The cold metal sent a shiver through her arm. Slowly, almost reverently, she climbed into the cockpit again. She stared at the worn ignition switch and the small brass key that still hung beside it. For a long moment she hesitated, then reached out and turned it gently. The engine coughed, a sharp, dry sound, then silence. She tried again. This time the propeller twitched, moving a fraction of an inch before stopping. The noise startled her, but also filled her with a thrill so deep it took her breath away. After decades of silence, the machine had answered. It wasn't alive yet, but it wasn't dead either. She laughed through her tears, her hands trembling as she sat there, breathing in the smell of fuel and dust. She imagined her grandfather sitting beside her, nodding, proud and calm. The echo of the engine's brief breath lingered in her ears like a heartbeat. It was the sound of life stirring where everyone else had seen nothing but ruin. That night, she wrote in her own notebook for the first time in years. Her handwriting was uneven, but her words flowed freely. Today I heard him again. Not his voice, but the sound of what he believed in. It was quiet, but it was enough. I will not let it die. She placed the notebook beside his on the workbench, then turned off the light and stood in the doorway of the garage. The moonlight reflected off the airplane's silver wings, casting a faint glow across the walls. The night was utterly still, as if listening with her. When she finally walked back to the house, her steps were light. For the first time since her divorce, since the long months of loneliness, she didn't feel broken. She felt connected to him, to the past, to something larger than herself. The house greeted her with its familiar creaks and whispers, but the silence no longer felt empty. It was full alive with promise. As she lay in bed, she could still smell the oil on her hands and hear the faint echo of that short-lived hum of the engine. It was fragile, imperfect, but it was enough to ignite something within her. The world outside might never understand what her grandfather had done, but she did, and she would carry that understanding forward. She fell asleep before dawn, dreaming of the sky, not the unreachable blue above the clouds, but the quiet expanse just before sunrise, when everything seems to hold its breath. In her dream, she saw herself at the controls, the plane lifting slowly off the ground, and her grandfather's voice whispering through the wind. Wings don't rust, Anna. They wait. When she woke, the sun was rising through the curtains, painting the room in gold. And she knew, with a certainty she hadn't felt in years, that her own waiting was over. The sun rose pale and unhurried over the hills, laying a thin veil of gold across the roof of the old garage. Inside, the air smelled of oil and effort. The plane stood where it had always stood, but now it seemed different, alive somehow, its faded metal shimmering faintly in the light. Anna stood at the threshold with a cup of coffee cooling in her hands, her breath forming little clouds that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. She had spent every day of the last few weeks inside that garage, cleaning, repairing, and learning to understand the language of her grandfather's world. What had once seemed like an impenetrable mystery of wires, bolts, and rust had become a rhythm she could follow. She could now name each tool, each sound, each faint vibration that came from the machine when she turned the propeller by hand. It was strange how quickly the human soul could change when given something to believe in. When she had first come to this place, she had been hollowed out, a woman stripped of everything she had thought gave her identity. But now, every morning when she pushed open those doors and smelled the air heavy with dust and oil, she felt herself expand again. The house no longer felt like a tomb. It had become a forge. Ray, the neighbor who had offered to help, arrived shortly after sunrise. He was in his 60s, tall and bent at the shoulders from years of mechanical work. His voice was rough but kind, and his hands, though calloused, handled every bolt and wire with a gentleness that matched her own. "Your grandfather knew his craft," he said one morning as he leaned over the open engine. "You can tell by how clean these connections are. Most amateurs would have cut corners, but not him." She smiled faintly, wiping sweat from her forehead. "He never did anything halfway." "Yeah," Ray said, tightening a bolt. "That generation didn't know how." They worked side by side for hours each day, removing corroded pieces, cleaning fuel lines, and checking every component of the small Continental engine. Sometimes they talked about nothing about the weather, about Ray's old motorcycle, about the strange quiet of the town. But often they worked in silence, the kind that doesn't weigh heavy but feels like an understanding between two people who share respect for the same thing. At night, Anna read through her grandfather's notebooks again, searching for guidance. The notes were technical, but beneath the equations there was poetry, a man speaking to the heavens with numbers instead of prayers. She began to see the pattern of his dream more clearly. The Aurora project had not just been a plane, but a promise to himself that he could still create something beautiful after the world had dismissed him. And now that promise belonged to her. Days passed, and the project consumed her. The once familiar ache of loss that had followed her from the city had been replaced by an almost fierce determination. She stopped measuring time in hours and began measuring it in progress. The smooth turn of the propeller, the gleam of polished metal, the soft hum of a newly installed cable. The sound of the engine's brief cough from that first night still echoed in her mind, pulling her forward. She knew now that it could run again. It was only a matter of patience, and patience was something her grandfather had left her in abundance. But not everyone shared her reverence for the work. One gray afternoon, while she was sanding the edge of the left wing, a car pulled into the driveway. She wiped her hands on a rag and stepped outside to see who it was. Her stomach dropped as soon as she recognized the sleek black sedan. It was her ex-husband, Mark. He stepped out in a tailored coat, his expression a blend of curiosity and condescension. Behind him, her cousin Laura climbed out, her expression carefully neutral. "I heard you were still here," Mark said, glancing toward the house and then the garage. "We wanted to see how you were doing." "We?" Anna repeated, crossing her arms. Laura smiled too sweetly. "Everyone's been worried about you, Anna. You've been out of touch for months. We just thought, maybe it's time to think about moving on." "Moving on," Anna said slowly. "From what exactly?" Laura gestured toward the garage. "From this whole thing. You're living alone in a house that's falling apart, pouring yourself into." "What? An old piece of scrap metal? You could sell the property, you know. There's a developer interested in the land. It could set you up for years." Mark nodded in agreement. "She's right. You don't need to be out here playing mechanic. This isn't you, Anna. You were always refined. This place, it's beneath you." Her pulse quickened, but her voice stayed calm. "You think fixing something broken is beneath me?" Mark's smile faltered. "I'm saying you deserve better than this." She looked at him then, really looked at him, the perfectly polished shoes, the way his eyes never really met hers, the faint impatience in his tone, as if everything he didn't understand was simply a waste of time. And in that instant, she realized that this man, the one she had once built her life around, had never truly seen her. He had seen an accessory, something that fit neatly into his world of clean lines and social expectations. But here, surrounded by dust and engine grease and the echo of her grandfather's dream, she had finally found herself again. "I already have better," she said softly, "and it's not for sale." Mark's jaw tightened. Laura sighed dramatically. "You can't honestly mean that. This house is falling apart. You're throwing your life away." Anna took a step closer to them, her voice steady but carrying an edge they had never heard from her before. "My grandfather spent his life building something that everyone else thought was useless. You all laughed at him, called him crazy, but he created something that mattered. He believed in something. Tell me, what have you ever built that will outlast you?" The silence that followed was heavy and satisfying. Mark looked away, muttering something about her being sentimental. Laura shook her head and turned back toward the car. "You're just like him," she said coldly. "You'll end up alone with your dreams, and nothing else." Anna smiled faintly. "Then I'll be in good company." They left without another word. She watched the car disappear down the road, the quiet settling again like dust. For a moment, her hands trembled from the surge of emotion, but then she turned back to the garage. Inside, the plane waited, steady and silent, as if approving of her defiance. That evening, she and Ray worked later than usual. He didn't ask about the visitors. Perhaps he didn't need to. The air smelled of gasoline and steel as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the window. Finally, after hours of tightening and testing, Ray straightened and wiped his hands. "She's ready," he said simply. Anna looked at him, her breath catching. "You mean?" He nodded. "We can try running her for real tomorrow. Everything's in place." She didn't sleep that night. The anticipation kept her awake, her mind racing with possibilities. What if the engine failed? What if it caught fire? What if the years of neglect had damaged it beyond repair? But beneath the worry was something steadier, a quiet excitement, a childlike thrill that reminded her of the days she had spent dreaming with her grandfather under the open sky. At dawn, Ray returned, carrying a small fuel canister. They filled the tank carefully, checked every connection one last time, and stood back. The morning was cool, the air still. Anna's hands shook as she climbed into the cockpit. She placed the photograph of her grandfather on the dashboard, his eyes smiling at her through the years. She took a deep breath, turned the key, and waited. The first sound was a cough, then another, then a low growl that built into a steady rumble. The propeller began to spin, slow at first, then faster, slicing through the air in a blur. The noise filled the garage, rattling the walls, echoing in her chest. Ray let out a shout of laughter, clapping his hands. "You did it!" he yelled over the roar. Anna couldn't answer. Her throat was too tight. She sat there, gripping the controls, her eyes wet, her heart pounding with something far greater than joy. It was connection, an invisible thread linking her to the man who had built this machine, who had believed in it, even when no one else did. The plane's voice filled the space, deep and alive, the sound of a dream that had refused to die. When she finally cut the engine, the silence that followed was almost reverent. The smell of fuel lingered, and the air trembled faintly from the echo of the propeller. Ray rested a hand on her shoulder and smiled. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said quietly. She nodded, unable to speak. Over the next few weeks, Anna continued the restoration, painting the wings, polishing the body, and sealing the cracks in the windows. The Cessna gleamed again, not as it once had, but as something reborn. Every time she looked at it, she saw her grandfather's hands guiding her own. The day she finished, she stood in the doorway of the garage, the setting sun washing everything in amber light. The airplane stood ready, silent but powerful, its wings stretching toward the open doors, as if yearning for the air. Anna stepped forward and placed her palm against the cool metal. "You built more than a machine, Grandpa," she whispered. "You built belief." Outside, the world was quiet. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. Above, the sky was streaked with pink and silver, and for a fleeting moment, 2 planes passed high overhead, their contrails crossing in a brilliant X of white against the darkening blue. Anna lifted her face to the sight, her heart swelling. She didn't need to fly. She already had. In every bolt tightened, every surface polished, every heartbeat that had echoed with the sound of that engine, she had risen from the ground. She had rebuilt not only the plane, but herself. Weeks later, when the first young mechanics came to her door, local kids curious about the strange woman who had restored a plane in her backyard, she welcomed them inside. They gathered around the Cessna, eyes wide with wonder, and she told them what her grandfather had once told her, that everyone needed a wing, even if invisible. She named the small workshop Aurora Wings in his honor, and on the wall above the workbench, she hung the brass plate from the cockpit. Beneath it, she placed a plaque engraved with the words he had once written in his journal. "When you can't fly yourself, help someone else to rise." Every evening, when the students left and the garage fell quiet again, she would sit beside the plane, tracing its outline in the dim light. Sometimes, she would hear the wind outside, brushing against the metal, whispering like a voice she knew well. And in those moments, she would smile, knowing that somewhere, beyond the clouds, her grandfather was listening too. The house no longer felt empty. It had become a place where past and future met, a sanctuary where dreams, once dismissed as foolish, had found their wings again. As night fell, the stars appeared one by one above the quiet town, and Anna sat beneath them, her heart calm and steady. The sound of the engine still echoed softly in her memory, but it no longer belonged only to him. It was hers now, the shared heartbeat of 2 lives, separated by time, but united by the same sky. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next story. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. Everyone reveals something new, something unforgettable. And be sure to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too powerful to keep to yourself.